I don't care if you're the King of England. Those heaps of scrap metal are a violation, and I've already filed a formal complaint with the county. They'll be towed and crushed by Friday. The voice, a grating symphony of entitlement and cheap perfume, sliced through the tranquil afternoon air I'd paid so dearly to cultivate. In front of me stood Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Crestwood Meadows Homeowners Association. She was a woman built like a filing cabinet, overflowing with decades of petty grievances, her floral muumuu straining against the sheer force of her indignation. Her index finger, tipped with a menacingly long acrylic nail, was pointed not at me, but past me towards my garage. In her other hand, she triumphantly waved a sheaf of papers like a declaration of war. Her face was a mask of smug certainty, the kind of look a person gets when they believe they hold all the power and are about to enjoy using it. She thought she was dropping a bomb. In reality, she had just handed me the pin to her own grenade. A slow, cold amusement, the kind I hadn't felt since my days in the JAG Corps dealing with barracks lawyers who thought they'd found a loophole in the UCMJ, began to unspool in my gut. She had filed a complaint with the county, a formal, official complaint that would trigger a specific, unyielding bureaucratic process. A process that, in its final stages of enforcement and appeal, landed squarely and unequivocally on the desk of the presiding judge of the county administrative court, a desk that I, Judge Marcus Thorne, had occupied for the last 8 years. She wasn't just reporting me to the county. In a beautifully ironic twist of fate, she was reporting me to myself. If you think Karen is about to get a lesson in civic procedure, she'll never forget, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd also love to hear your own HOA nightmare story, because misery loves company, but justice loves an audience. Trust me, you'll want to see how this plays out, because the wheels of justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine, especially when you're the one who gets to add the grease. Now let me back up and paint the full picture. My name is Marcus Thorne. Before I wore the black robes of a judge, I wore the uniform of a United States Army captain. I spent 12 years as a judge advocate general, dealing with everything from petty theft to courts-martial and dusty, far-flung places, where the rule of law was more of a suggestion than a mandate. It taught me patience. It taught me that victory doesn't always go to the loudest person in the room, but to the most prepared. And it taught me that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is a thorough understanding of the rules of engagement. When I retired from the service, I went into private practice for a while, but the soulless grind of corporate law wasn't for me. I wanted to serve, so I ran for judge, won, and spent the better part of a decade trying to be a steady, impartial hand on the scales of local justice. It was a good life, a meaningful one, but it was demanding. When my wife passed away 2 years ago, the silence in our big city house became deafening. I needed a change. I needed a project. I needed peace. That's what brought me to Crestwood Meadows. It was advertised as a quiet, respectable enclave, a place for professionals and retirees. My new house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, and most importantly, it came with a massive 3-car garage and a long private driveway. It was the perfect place to finally undertake the one thing I'd been dreaming of for 30 years, restoring my father's cars. He had left me 2 glorious pieces of American steel. The first was a 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1. Its candy apple red paint faded, but its bones still strong. It was the car he'd bought brand new after his first promotion. The second was a hulking 1972 Chevrolet Chevelle SS, a beast of a machine he'd won in a poker game in the late 70s. They weren't just cars, they were time capsules. They were the last tangible connection I had to the man who taught me about integrity, hard work, and the sweet satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life with your own 2 hands. They were my therapy, my sanctuary. They were carefully parked on the far side of my driveway, nestled close to the garage, each one draped in a heavy-duty, form-fitting canvas cover. They were not, by any stretch of the imagination, heaps of scrap metal. They were my inheritance, my future, and as I would soon discover, the catalyst for a war I never wanted to fight but was uniquely qualified to win. My first hint of trouble came not as a bang, but as a whimper of passive aggression, slipped neatly under the windshield wiper of my daily driver. The initial violation notice was a masterpiece of bureaucratic condescension. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the Crestwood Meadows HOA logo, a sterile-looking tree inside a perfect circle. The font was an officious Times New Roman, the language dripping with thinly veiled threats couched in polite jargon. It cited Bylaw 7, Section 4, Paragraph C. The visible storage of inoperable, unlicensed, or dismantled vehicles on any property is strictly prohibited. A fine of $50 was assessed, with a stern warning that the fine would double every 7 days the violation remained uncorrected. I read it, a slight smile playing on my lips. It was amateur hour. They had made a critical error in their opening salvo. They assumed facts not in evidence. My cars were not inoperable. They were under restoration. They were not unlicensed. Both had valid collector vehicle registrations with the state DMV, copies of which were in my file cabinet. They were not dismantled, merely non-operational pending the engine rebuilds. And the term visible storage was legally ambiguous, especially since they were on private property and under form-fitting covers that clearly delineated them as protected vehicles, not abandoned husks. I decided to treat it as a simple misunderstanding. As a judge, I always presume good faith until proven otherwise. I typed up a polite, professional response. I didn't mention my profession. I simply signed it, Marcus Thorne, homeowner at 121 Oak Bend Court. In the letter, I respectfully pointed out the distinctions between a vehicle under restoration and an inoperable one, citing the relevant definitions from the state's own vehicle code. I attached photocopies of their current registrations and a brief one-page summary of my restoration plan, noting that all work would be conducted inside my garage to minimize any disruption. I concluded by stating that, given these facts, no violation had occurred and I was respectfully requesting the fine be rescinded. I mailed it via certified post, a habit from my lawyer days. It creates an undeniable record of receipt. I expected that would be the end of it. A week later, a second envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was another fine, this one for $100. Stapled to it was my original letter, returned without comment, save for a sloppy, handwritten scrawl in red ink at the bottom of the violation notice. Rules apply to everyone, Mr. Thorne. The way she'd italicized and underlined Mr. was a deliberate, petty jab. It was a clear signal. This wasn't about the rules. It was about power. This was Karen staking her claim, establishing her dominance over the new guy on the block. My amusement began to curdle into a familiar cold resolve. I had seen this behavior before, in overzealous NCOs and tin pot dictators in foreign courtrooms. It was the mark of a small person desperately trying to feel big. That afternoon, as I was sorting through a box of carburetor components, a small, bird-like woman with kind eyes and a nervous tremor in her hands paused by my driveway. It was my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable. She had lived in Crestwood Meadows for over 30 years. "I saw the notice on your car last week," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I saw her drop that other one in your box this morning. Please be careful." She proceeded to tell me a story that made my blood run cold. For 2 decades, she had cultivated a magnificent rose garden along the side of her house. It was her late husband's pride and joy. Last year, Karen, armed with a tape measure and a copy of the bylaws, declared that the wooden trellises supporting the climbing roses were 1.5 inches taller than the 6-foot maximum allowed for fence-like structures. Karen gave her 48 hours to remove them. When Mrs. Gable, heartbroken, explained that removing the trellises would destroy the decades-old roses, Karen was unmoved. She threatened daily fines, a lien on the property, and public shaming in the HOA newsletter. Terrified and alone, the 78-year-old widow paid a gardener to come and rip out the entire garden, trellises and all. "She watched from her window the whole time," Mrs. Gable said, a tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. "Just watched," with this little smile on her face. In that moment, my fight ceased to be about 2 classic cars. It became about a desecrated rose garden. It became about every person this woman had bullied into submission. Karen had mistaken my quiet, peaceful nature for weakness. She had no idea that she was methodically chipping away at a dam of professional discipline, behind which lay a reservoir of strategic patience and a deep, abiding hatred for bullies. She had just picked a fight with a man who had dismantled entire command structures with less evidence than a 1.5-inch infraction. The game was on. The confrontation that I opened with occurred 2 weeks after that second notice. I had, of course, refused to pay the escalating fines. Instead, I sent another certified letter, this time addressed to the entire HOA board, formally disputing the violation and the fines, and requesting a formal hearing as stipulated in the association's own governing documents. I also included a polite but firm paragraph reminding them of their fiduciary duty to all homeowners and the potential legal ramifications of selective and malicious enforcement. It was a warning shot, a legal flare sent up to see if anyone on that board had an ounce of sense. The response was not a letter. It was Karen in the flesh, her face flushed with rage, stomping up my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. This was the moment she chose to inform me she'd gone over the HOA's head. "A hearing?" she screeched, the papers in her hand trembling with her fury. "You don't get a hearing. You're in violation, and you're arrogant about it. I'm done with letters and fines." That's when she delivered her grand pronouncement about the county complaint about my cars being crushed by Friday. She shoved the paperwork into my chest. I didn't react. I didn't raise my voice. I simply took the packet from her. My calmness seemed to infuriate her more than any argument could have. "Is that all?" I asked, my voice even. Her mouth opened and closed like a beached fish. She had expected me to yell, to threaten, to plead. My quiet composure was not part of her script. "You'll see," she sputtered, finally finding her voice. "You'll see when the county tow trucks show up. You think you're so smart. You're not above the rules." She turned on her heel and marched away, her entire body a rigid column of self-righteous victory. I waited until her car disappeared around the corner before I allowed myself a slow, deep breath. I walked back inside my quiet house, the packet of papers cool in my hand. I sat down at my large oak dining table, the one I'd bought specifically for hosting family dinners that would now never happen, and I began to read. The complaint was addressed to the Jefferson County Code Enforcement Division. It was a formal request for an investigation and abatement of a public nuisance under County Ordinance 113-8, blight and unkempt property. It was a powerful tool, usually reserved for genuinely abandoned properties with collapsing roofs, waist-high weeds, and infestations. Karen had creatively interpreted blight to include my 2 covered classic vehicles. She had attached photos, taken from the street, that were deliberately framed to make them look as derelict as possible. But the most beautiful part, the detail that made the entire situation sing with poetic justice, was the final page. It was the official county form, and at the bottom, it outlined the process. Step 1, investigation by a code enforcement officer. Step 2, issuance of a notice to abate if a violation is found. Step 3, a 30-day period for the homeowner to comply or appeal. Step 4, if appealed, the case is heard by the county administrative court. Step 5, if the court upholds the violation, an abatement order is issued. That order, the final, legally binding document that would authorize county agents to enter my property and seize my cars, required the signature of the presiding judge. Me. My heart didn't pound. My breath didn't quicken. Instead, a profound and placid sense of clarity washed over me. Karen, in her blind arrogance, had delivered the entire conflict, gift-wrapped, into the one arena on earth where I was an absolute master. She thought she was playing checkers, but she had just stumbled onto a grandmaster's chessboard. She had not only given me the weapon to defeat her, but she had also provided the official, documented, government-stamped invitation to do so. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of the house no longer feeling empty, but filled with the low hum of possibility. I couldn't preside over my own case, of course. That would be a gross ethical violation. But I didn't need to. The system itself, the one I knew intimately, would be the instrument of justice. Karen wanted to use the law as a cudgel to beat me into submission. I was about to teach her what it felt like when the law was used as a scalpel. My fight for my father's cars for Mrs. Gable's Roses had just been given a formal case number, and I knew with the certainty of a well-researched legal opinion that discovery was going to be an absolute nightmare for one Karen Miller, president of the Crestwood Meadows HOA. The first order of business was to handle the judicial ethics of the situation. The next morning, before court was in session, I walked into the clerk's office. "Morning, Sarah," I said to the chief clerk, a woman who had run the administrative side of the court with terrifying efficiency for 20 years. "I need to file a notice of recusal." I handed her the form I had filled out at home. On the line for reason for recusal, I had written, "Direct personal involvement as the subject of the administrative action in case file CE 202-3481. Sarah read it, her eyebrows shooting up towards her hairline. "CE 481? A code enforcement action? Against you, Judge?" I gave her a thin smile. "It would appear a neighbor has taken issue with my hobby." She looked from the form back to me, a glimmer of understanding, and dare I say, amusement in her eyes. She knew my reputation for being by the book. She also knew the political landscape of the county's various homeowner associations. "I'll see to it that Judge Albright is assigned," she said, stamping the document with a satisfying thud. "He's a stickler for procedure. He'll give it a fair look." "That's all I ask," I replied. With my ethical obligations fulfilled and my own case now in the impartial hands of a colleague, I was free. I was no longer Judge Thorne, bound by the bench. I was Marcus Thorne, private citizen, a retired Army lawyer with a specific skill set and a very clear objective. The war had two fronts. The first was the defensive action against the county complaint. That would be straightforward. Documentation, evidence, and a calm presentation of the facts to the code enforcement officer and, if necessary, to Judge Albright. The second, more important front was the counteroffensive. Karen had used a public process to attack me. I would use public processes to dismantle her. That evening, my dining room table transformed from a place of quiet meals to a war room. I submitted a series of formal requests under the state's Open Records Act. One to the HOA's management company for all financial statements, budgets, and vendor contracts for the past 5 years. Another for the complete unredacted minutes of every board meeting in that same period. A third for all records from the Architectural Review Committee, including all applications, denials, and the justifications for each. The law required them to comply. They could drag their feet, but they couldn't refuse. While I waited for that treasure trove to arrive, I started with what was already publicly available online through the county registrar and the Secretary of State's office. I pulled the HOA's original articles of incorporation, their bylaws and their covenants, conditions and restrictions, the CC&Rs. I read every single word, highlighting, cross-referencing, and making notes in the margins. I was searching for inconsistencies, for ambiguities, for any deviation from their own established procedures. It was tedious, painstaking work, the kind that made law students' eyes glaze over. But to me, it was like deciphering a map to buried treasure. And then I found the first thread. In the financial summaries from the previous year's annual meeting, there was a line item for $15,000 listed as community enhancement projects. There was no detail, no specific vendor, just a lump sum. In another section, under landscaping, I saw a recurring monthly payment of $2,500 to a company called Greenscape Solutions. A quick search of the state's business registry showed that Greenscape Solutions was a registered LLC. Nothing unusual there. But then I cross-referenced the address listed for the company. It was a P.O. box. I dug deeper, pulling the original incorporation documents for Greenscape. The registered agent, the person legally responsible for the company, was listed as Gerald Miller, Karen's husband. This wasn't just a conflict of interest, it was a potential case of self-dealing, funneling HOA funds to a family business without disclosure or a competitive bidding process, a clear violation of their own bylaws regarding board member conduct. But the most interesting find was a name that appeared over and over again in the Architectural Review Committee's approvals for minor additions and modifications. K Enterprises. This entity was consistently listed as the approved contractor for new decks, patio covers, and fence installations. For a small local contractor, they had a curious monopoly on the neighborhood's home improvement projects. Another search in the state database revealed K Enterprises was a sole proprietorship. The owner? Karen Miller, using her maiden name, Karen Pruitt. The threads were no longer just threads. They were starting to weave themselves into a rope with which Karen, in her infinite arrogance, was meticulously preparing to hang herself. My job was simply to provide her with the opportunity and the platform to do so. The documents I had requested began to arrive in thick manila envelopes, each one a new chapter in the sordid novel of Karen's reign. As I pieced together the story, I realized I couldn't and shouldn't fight this war alone. A victory for me that left everyone else still under her thumb would be hollow. This needed to be a community restoration project. My first visit was to Mrs. Gable. I brought a thermos of tea and a plate of cookies from the local bakery. We sat in her small, immaculate living room, surrounded by photos of her late husband and their life together. I didn't present myself as a crusader. I simply said, "Mrs. Gable, the issue with my cars has led me to look into the HOA's official records. I'm concerned by what I'm finding in your story about the rose garden. It seems to be part of a larger pattern. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share any other experiences you've had." The floodgates opened. She spoke of the time Karen measured the color of her front door with a paint swatch from the hardware store and declared it unapproved beige, forcing her to repaint it. She told me about the fines levied against a young family, the Garcias, because their children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk were deemed graffiti. She mentioned a man down the street, a former Marine, who was in a constant battle with Karen over the flagpole in his front yard. Armed with these names, I continued my quiet reconnaissance. I found the Garcias, a young couple with two small children, weary and frustrated. They had been saving for a down payment, and the constant nickel and dime fines were genuinely hurting them. "We got a violation because our daughter's tricycle was on the lawn for 2 hours," Mr. Garcia told me, his voice tight with anger. "Not overnight. 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon." His wife Maria pulled out a thick accordion file. "I've kept everything," she said. "Every notice, every check I've written, photos of the supposed violations. I don't know why I started, but I felt like I had to. It was a goldmine of documented harassment." My next stop was the house with the flagpole. I knocked on the door and was greeted by a man in his late 20s with a sharp, disciplined energy. His name was David. He had done 2 tours in Afghanistan and now worked as a project manager for a construction company. The flag in his yard was not the American flag, but the official flag of the United States Marine Corps. "She told me it wasn't a permissible flag," David said, his jaw clenched. "Said I could fly the stars and stripes on designated holidays, but this one was against the rules. This flag represents my brothers who didn't come home. I'm not taking it down." I saw in him a fellow veteran, a man who understood chain of command but bristled at illegitimate authority. He was exactly the ally I needed. I invited all of them, Mrs. Gable, the Garcias, and David, to my house that Friday evening. I cleared the dining table of legal documents and laid out coffee and cake. For the first hour, I just let them talk, sharing their stories of frustration and helplessness. The air crackled with shared grievance. It was a support group for the tyrannized. Then I stood up and walked to a whiteboard I had set up. "I want to show you something," I said. I didn't tell them I was a judge. I simply introduced myself as a retired military lawyer who knew how to read documents. One by one, I laid out the facts. I showed them the bylaw Karen had violated by not disclosing her husband's landscaping company. I showed them the state business filings for her own K Enterprises. I showed them the Architectural Review Committee records, demonstrating how applications from her friends or from people who used her company were approved in days, while others languished for months or were denied for absurd reasons. I drew a diagram connecting Karen, her husband, and the flow of HOA funds. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, undeniable map of their own money. The room was silent. The Garcias looked stunned. Mrs. Gable had her hand over her mouth. David, the Marine, just stared at the board, his eyes narrowed. "It's a slush fund," he said, the words cutting through the silence. "She's using the HOA as her personal piggy bank and the rules as her own private army to keep everyone in line." "Precisely," I said. "Her power comes from the belief that she is untouchable and that each of you is alone. She picks you off one by one. The tricycle, the flag, the roses. Small enough battles that you'll just give in and pay the fine to make it go away. But when you put it all together, I tapped the whiteboard. It tells a different story, a story of systemic corruption and abuse of power. Maria Garcia looked up, her eyes shining with a new fire. What do we do? It was the question I had been waiting for. We continue to gather evidence, I said. David, with your construction background, you can help me analyze the contracts. Maria, your file is invaluable. Mrs. Gable, your history here is our institutional memory. We fight this not with anger, but with facts. We will build a case so airtight that when we present it, it will be undeniable. A quiet, determined energy filled the room. The fear and isolation had been replaced by a sense of shared purpose. We were no longer a collection of disgruntled individuals. We were an alliance. And Karen, blissfully unaware, was about to find out what happens when the sheep she'd been shearing decide to hire a wolf. The key to victory, I knew, lay not in the small battles Karen wanted to fight, but in finding the one critical vulnerability in her fortress of lies. Her complaint about my cars had put her on the county's radar. My job was to direct that radar beam away from my driveway and onto the things she valued most. The brand new, gleaming community clubhouse and pool area. It was her magnum opus, the monument to her presidency. The renovation had been completed just 6 months prior, at a cost of nearly $300,000 of the community's money. It was her crown jewel, and I had a strong suspicion it was made of glass. With David's help, we began to dissect the clubhouse project. David, as a project manager, knew exactly what to look for. We cross-referenced the HOA's internal budget documents with the permit filings we obtained from the county planning department. The discrepancies were staggering. The HOA's records showed a payment of $75,000 to K Enterprises for pool deck and patio construction. However, the permit filed with the county for that same work listed the cost of materials and labor at only $30,000. That was a $45,000 discrepancy flowing directly into Karen's pocket. But the real bombshell was not in the financials, but in the blueprints. Marcus, look at this, David said one evening, pointing to the electrical schematic for the pool area. This is completely wrong. The code requires all outlets within 20 feet of the water's edge to be on a GFCI circuit. This plan has them wired directly to the main panel, and the conduit they specified for the underwater lighting, it's not rated for submersion. This is a massive electrocution hazard. We kept digging. The plans for the new deck extending from the clubhouse showed it was supported by 4 by 4 posts. County code for a structure of that size and height required 6 by 6 posts. The joist spacing was too wide. The ledger board wasn't properly attached to the building's foundation. It was a collapse waiting to happen. She didn't just skim money, David said, his face pale. She actively cut corners on safety. She put every man, woman, and child who uses that pool at risk just to pad her pockets. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when we looked at the inspection record. The project had received initial sign-offs on the foundation and rough framing from a county inspector named Bill Richardson. But the final inspection, the one that would grant the project a certificate of occupancy and declare it safe and complete, was never done. The file was simply marked pending. I did a quick search for Inspector Richardson. He had taken an early retirement 2 months ago, citing personal reasons, shortly after signing off on the flawed framing. It smelled like a payoff. This was the legal trap. The entire HOA was predicated on the value and usability of its common areas. The clubhouse was the principal asset. Without a certificate of occupancy, the entire structure was technically illegal. It couldn't be insured properly. If someone were to be injured or worse, due to the faulty wiring or the unstable deck, the liability wouldn't just fall on Karen. It would fall on the entire HOA. Every single homeowner would be exposed to a potentially ruinous lawsuit. Karen's petty complaint about my cars was a nuisance. This was an existential threat to the entire community. She had gambled their financial solvency and physical safety for her own greed, all while harassing them over tricycles and flags. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The time for quiet evidence gathering was almost over. It was time to bring the authorities into the picture, but it had to be done carefully. I couldn't be seen to be using my position. The tip had to be clean, anonymous, and most importantly, actionable. I sat down at my computer and drafted a simple one-page letter. I didn't use legal jargon or fancy language. I wrote it from the perspective of a concerned, unnamed homeowner. I pointed to specific county building codes, the electrical requirements for pools, the support specifications for decks. I mentioned the lack of a final certificate of occupancy for the Crestwood Meadows Clubhouse project, permit number C-202-2-894. I didn't mention fraud or Karen's name. I didn't have to. I simply laid out a series of undeniable public safety concerns and pointed the inspectors to the exact location of the potential violations. I printed it, put it in a plain white envelope, and drove to a post office in the next town over to mail it to the office of the County Inspector General. It was a single anonymous letter. A spark dropped into a room filled with gasoline. Now all we had to do was wait for the explosion. A week later, a Jefferson County code enforcement vehicle pulled up to my curb. A man in a crisp uniform shirt with a name badge that read Henderson got out. He was tall, lean, and had the weary, no-nonsense look of a man who had seen every possible excuse. This was the first test. I met him at the end of my driveway, my hands empty, my demeanor calm and cooperative. "Mr. Thorne?" he asked. "I'm Officer Henderson. We received a complaint regarding two inoperable vehicles on your property." "Of course, officer," I said. "Please come take a look. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." I led him to the two covered shapes. "The complainant," I said, using the neutral term, described them as heaps of scrap metal. "I think you'll find that's not quite accurate." I unhooked the elastic on the Mustang's cover and peeled it back. The afternoon sun glinted off the primer gray fender and the chrome trim around the windshield. The interior was stripped, but it was clean and orderly. "This is a 1969 Mustang Mach 1, I explained. "It was my father's. I'm doing a full frame-off restoration." I then uncovered the Chevelle. Henderson let out a low whistle. "A 72 SS. Don't see many of those anymore." "She's next in line," I said. I handed him a slim folder. Inside was a copy of my restoration plan, the current collector vehicle registrations, and photos of the cars from when my father first bought them. As you can see, they're fully registered with the state. They're not abandoned, and all the work is being done inside the garage. I just keep them covered out here for easier access. Henderson reviewed the documents, his expression unreadable. He walked around the cars, looked at the clean state of my driveway, and then looked back at the complaint form in his hand. "The ordinance is about blight, Mr. Thorne. This," he said, gesturing to the cars, "is a project. It's clean. It's organized. You're in compliance with your registration. Frankly, I've got actual junk cars piled on top of each other in other parts of the county that I need to deal with." He sighed, the sound of a man burdened by trivialities. "The complaint was filed, so I had to come out. I'll be marking this as unfounded. You won't be hearing from us again about this matter." He was professional, by the book, a good public servant. As he turned to leave, I played my card. It had to be casual, conversational, a harmless observation from one citizen to another. "Appreciate you clearing that up, officer. I know you guys are busy. Must have been a mountain of paperwork last year with that big clubhouse renovation over on Aspen Way." I saw a flicker in his eyes. He stopped. "That was a big job," he said, his tone guarded. "Yeah, a real centerpiece for the neighborhood," I continued, my voice friendly. "I remember seeing old Inspector Richardson out there a few times before he retired. Seemed like a nice enough fellow. Surprised he left so suddenly." I let the name hang in the air. Bill Richardson, the inspector who signed off on the faulty framing. Henderson's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Every department has its gossip, its problem children, its skeletons." I had just shown him I knew the name of one of his. "Folks retire when they're ready," he said noncommittally, but the seed was planted. He now knew that a resident of this neighborhood, the same one who had just been the subject of a malicious and unfounded complaint, was also aware of the clubhouse project and the inspector tied to it. When my anonymous letter about that very same project landed on the Inspector General's desk, it would no longer seem entirely random. It would have context. Henderson got in his truck and drove away. Front one of the war was officially won. My cars were safe. Now I watched the clubhouse at the end of the street, waiting for the first signs of a much larger, more significant battle to begin. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, 2 white county vans and a sedan from the planning department pulled into the clubhouse parking lot. 4 people got out, armed with clipboards, tape measures, and a heavy-duty tool case. They were there for hours. The anonymous tip had worked. The system, once engaged, was relentless. The first sign that the walls were closing in was the appearance of the signs. They were large, rectangular, and a lurid shade of red. Plastered on the glass doors of the clubhouse and on the gate to the pool, the words were stark and uncompromising. Unsafe to occupy. This structure is closed by order of the Jefferson County Department of Building and Safety. Padlocks, thick and industrial, were looped through the door handles, their metallic sheen a final, irrefutable statement of authority. The news spread through Crestwood Meadows like a shockwave. Phone calls and text messages flew back and forth. A frantic, all-caps email from Karen landed in everyone's inbox, announcing an emergency HOA meeting to be held in 2 days' time at the local middle school cafeteria, since their own clubhouse was now, inconveniently, a legally designated hazard zone. Her email was a masterclass in deflection and blame shifting. She wrote of a coordinated and malicious attack on their community by a disgruntled individual working with overzealous county bureaucrats. She painted a picture of a neighborhood under siege from outside forces, with herself as the valiant defender of their property values and way of life. It was a bold strategy, an attempt to rally the community around her by creating a common enemy. But she underestimated the groundwork I had laid. The whispers that had started in my living room had grown into quiet conversations between neighbors. The Garcias had shared their story with the young couple across the street. David had spoken to other veterans in the neighborhood. Mrs. Gable, emboldened by the alliance, had started talking to her friends, women she'd known for 30 years, who had all suffered their own minor indignities at Karen's hand. The narrative was already competing with Karen's official version. While Karen was busy crafting her email, another, more discreet set of events was unfolding. The Inspector General's investigation had moved with surprising speed. The obvious and dangerous code violations at the clubhouse had given them probable cause to look deeper. They subpoenaed the contracts and payment records from the HOA's management company. They pulled the incorporation documents for K Enterprises and Greenscape Solutions. The simple map I had drawn on my whiteboard was now being reconstructed with the full force and authority of a government investigation. Then came the second blow, the one that hit every single homeowner directly in the wallet. A letter arrived from the HOA's insurance carrier. I opened mine and read it with a sense of grim satisfaction. The language was cold and precise. Due to the recent closure of the primary insured asset, the community clubhouse and pool, permit number C-2022-894, by county officials citing significant safety and building code violations, and in light of an active investigation into potential contractor fraud related to the renovation of said asset, coverage for all common areas under policy number 774-A9 is hereby suspended, effective immediately. It went on to explain that until the structure was brought up to code, issued a certificate of occupancy, and the fraud investigation was resolved, the neighborhood was effectively uninsured. If a delivery driver tripped on a crack in the common sidewalk, if a child fell off the playground equipment, the resulting lawsuit would not be covered. The liability would be shared among all 150 homeowners. The potential cost was astronomical. The email from Karen had created anxiety. The letter from the insurance company created pure, unadulterated panic. The disgruntled individual narrative was collapsing under the weight of financial reality. Homeowners were no longer worried about who to blame. They were worried about their life savings being wiped out by a lawsuit. The emergency meeting was no longer going to be a rally for Karen. It was going to be her trial, and I would be the prosecution, armed not with legal authority, but with a folder full of her own lies, ready to be presented to a jury of her peers. The night of the meeting, I put on a simple pair of gray slacks and a crisp blue button-down shirt. No suit, no tie. I was not Judge Thorne. I was Marcus Thorne, homeowner. David, the Garcias, and Mrs. Gable met me in the school parking lot. We were a small, quiet group, but we were united. David carried a laptop. Maria Garcia clutched her thick file. Mrs. Gable held a single, perfect rose from the new garden she had started planting. It was a symbol of what had been lost and what we were fighting to restore. We walked into the crowded, noisy cafeteria together, ready for the final confrontation. The middle school cafeteria buzzed with the anxious energy of a hornet's nest that had just been kicked. Over 100 homeowners were crammed into the space, their faces a mixture of anger, fear, and confusion. At the front of the room, behind a folding table, sat Karen and the other two board members, a timid man named Arthur, who always looked like he was apologizing for taking up space, and a woman who seemed to be a carbon copy of Karen, just 20 years younger. Karen, sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights, banged a small gavel on the table. "Order! Let's bring this emergency meeting to order," she yelled, her voice straining to project authority she no longer possessed. She launched into her prepared speech, a rambling tirade about government overreach and the vindictive actions of a single homeowner who couldn't follow simple rules. She was trying to frame the entire disaster as a consequence of my junk cars. The crowd was not buying it. "What about the insurance, Karen?" someone shouted from the back. "Why is the clubhouse unsafe?" yelled another. "My realtor just told me I have to disclose this, and it's killing my property value." Karen's face was a crumbling facade of confidence. "These are temporary setbacks. We are working with the county to resolve these administrative errors," she began, but her words were drowned out by a chorus of angry questions. She kept banging the gavel, pleading for order, but she had lost control. The fear she had so carefully cultivated for years had turned into a rage she could not contain. This was my moment. I waited for a brief lull in the shouting, and then I stood up. I didn't shout. I simply stood, silent and patient, until a few people noticed, and then a few more. A ripple of quiet spread from my position in the middle of the room. "My name is Marcus Thorne," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the sudden hush. "I am the homeowner Karen is referring to." All eyes turned to me. Karen glared, her eyes shooting daggers. "You are out of order," she shrieked. "This is a witch hunt." "No, Karen," I replied, my voice still level. "This is an accounting. You have accused me of causing this. I am here to present the facts and let our neighbors decide for themselves." Before she could object further, David was at the front of the room, plugging his laptop into the projector the school used for assemblies. The first image that flashed onto the large screen behind Karen's head was a copy of the HOA's financial statement, with the $2,500 monthly payment to Greenscape Solutions highlighted. "This is our money," I said, my voice narrating the slideshow. "Going every month to a company owned by Karen's husband, Gerald Miller, without disclosure and without a competitive bid, a direct violation of Bylaw 12. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I motioned for David to click to the next slide. It was the incorporation document for K Enterprises, showing Karen's maiden name. The next slide was the $75,000 payment order for the pool deck, followed by the county permit showing a declared cost of only $30,000. "This is a $45,000 difference," I stated simply. "Where did that money go, Karen?" She was speechless, her face ashen. The crowd was no longer murmuring, they were openly hostile, directing their anger squarely at her. Then I brought it home. "This isn't just about money," I said, my voice hardening. "This is about safety." David displayed the blueprint for the pool's electrical system, with the non-compliant wiring circled in red. Then the schematic for the deck, showing the undersized support posts. "Your president, in an effort to skim money for herself, approved construction that puts every single one of our children at risk of electrocution or injury from a deck collapse. That is why the county shut it down. That is why we lost our insurance, not because of my cars, because of her greed." It was then that David, the Marine, stood tall. "According to our bylaws, a motion can be made from the floor for a vote of no confidence in any board member. I so move that we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen Miller as president of this HOA." A man in the front row immediately jumped to his feet. "I second it." Just then, Mrs. Gable walked slowly towards the front of the room, clutching her single rose. She stopped in front of the table and looked Karen directly in the eye. Her voice, though soft, was filled with a strength no one had heard from her in years. "You made me tear out my husband's roses," she said, her voice trembling but clear. You said it was about the rules, but it was never about the rules. It was about making you feel powerful and me feel small. You did that to all of us." She placed the rose gently on the table in front of Karen. It was a quiet, devastating act of defiance. The vote was a formality. It was nearly unanimous. Karen was stripped of her title, her power, her entire identity in the community she had ruled with an iron fist. She sat there, stunned into silence, as the homeowners began to organize, calling for a full audit and the formation of an interim board. As she finally gathered her things and tried to make a discreet exit from the side of the cafeteria, she found her path blocked. Two uniformed sheriff's deputies were standing there, their expressions impassive. One of them held up a warrant. "Karen Miller, you're under arrest for multiple counts of felony fraud and embezzlement." Her face, already pale, turned a ghostly white. Her reign of petty tyranny, which began with a complaint about two classic cars, had ended here, in a borrowed cafeteria, under the hum of fluorescent lights with the cold final click of handcuffs. The months that followed were a period of intense but necessary reconstruction for Crestwood Meadows. An interim board was quickly formed, with David stepping up as the acting president. His project management skills proved invaluable as he took charge of the monumental task of cleaning up Karen's mess. Maria Garcia, with her meticulous records, became the board's secretary, ensuring that every action was documented and transparent. They hired a forensic accountant who clawed back some of the embezzled funds and a reputable law firm to navigate the legal minefield Karen had left behind. The community, once divided and fearful, was now united with a common purpose. Neighbors who had previously only exchanged curt nods were now stopping to talk in the street, attending board meetings, and volunteering for committees. The process of rebuilding their HOA was also rebuilding their sense of community. I was asked several times to take on an official role, but I politely declined. I had played my part. Now I just wanted to be a neighbor. I offered David advice when he asked for it, explaining procedural points or helping him decipher complex legal documents. But I did it from my living room, over coffee, as a friend. The story of what happened became a quiet legend around the Jefferson County Courthouse. Judge Albright, who had formally dismissed the county's case against me months ago, caught me in the hallway one afternoon. "Heard you had a bit of a local governance issue, Marcus," he said, a broad grin on his face. "Resolved it, I trust?" "Through the appropriate channels, of course," I replied, and we shared a knowing look. The system had worked. Karen's legal troubles were extensive. Faced with a mountain of evidence, she took a plea deal. She was convicted of felony fraud, sentenced to 2 years in prison, and ordered to pay nearly $200,000 in restitution to the HOA. Her husband's landscaping contract was terminated, and his company went bankrupt shortly thereafter. They were forced to sell their house to pay the legal fees and restitution, and they left Crestwood Meadows in disgrace. The clubhouse remained closed for the better part of a year. A special assessment had to be levied on the homeowners to pay for the repairs, but under David's transparent leadership, everyone understood why it was necessary. A new, highly regarded contractor was hired. They tore down the faulty deck and rebuilt it with the proper supports. They rewired the entire pool area, installing the latest safety features. When it finally reopened the following summer, the community held a grand reopening party. There was a barbecue, music, and children laughing and splashing in the safe, legally compliant pool. Mrs. Gable was there, surrounded by friends, her face radiant. She had been appointed head of a new Community Beautification Committee, and she had organized the planting of new flower beds all around the restored clubhouse. They were filled with roses. One sunny Saturday morning, about a year after that fateful emergency meeting, a deep, throaty roar echoed down the cul-de-sac. It was the sound of 351 cubic inches of Cleveland Wive 8 coming to life for the first time in 30 years. I sat in the driver's seat of the 1969 Mustang Mach-1, my hands resting lightly on the wheel. The car was glorious. Its body was a flawless sheet of candy apple red, gleaming under a fresh, clear coat. The chrome bumpers shone like mirrors. Every nut and bolt had been cleaned, restored, or replaced. It was more than a car. It was a promise kept. I let the engine idle, the loping rumble a sweet symphony of mechanical perfection. I looked next door and saw Mrs. Gable tending to her new rose garden, which was even more magnificent than the one she had lost. Down the street, David was washing his truck, the Marine Corps flag flying proudly from a new, perfectly installed, and fully HOA-approved flagpole. The Garcia's kids were riding their tricycles on the sidewalk, their chalk drawings a colorful welcome mural on the concrete. I put the Mustang in gear, the shifter clicking satisfyingly into place. I pulled out of my driveway and took a slow, triumphant drive through the neighborhood. The sun was warm on my face, the wind whistling through the open windows. The sound of the engine was the sound of victory. It was the sound of justice, patiently restored. It was the sound of a community that had taken back its peace. And as I drove, I knew my father would have been proud, not just of the car, but of the fight. A fight for fairness, for decency, and for the simple right to work on an old car in your own driveway in peace.